Welcome to Saving Ollie. Much like the war movie Saving Ryan, Ollie has been in a war with 3 children and now a granddaughter. So it's come time to repair Ollie, who happens to be a 1970 vintage Little Tikes riding toy. He looks to be in pretty good shape, and actually is, except for one small problem. Ollie has one wheel that has completely come apart, as you can see. Not only is there a huge chunk missing, the wheel is split down the middle, almost all the way around. I've already glued some of this back together. The little shiny area you see there is actually epoxy from the repair I've already done. So picking up with the repair about midway through to really getting to the most difficult part, to saving Ollie. In order to epoxy the wheel halves back together, what I decided to do was to tape the wheel together for 2 reasons. One, to keep the joint together. Secondly, to make sure the epoxy would not run out. And I used just regular masking tape. Any kind of tape that is non-stretch will do fine. So once I taped an area together, it's kind of hard to see unless you can get the light just right. I filled that area with epoxy, set the wheel up so the epoxy would stay in place, because it's kind of runny for 5, 10, 15 minutes, just depending on the type of epoxy you use. Once that's set up, then I would remove the tape, tape another area together, and epoxy that. And again, I'll get a better picture in a minute of the inside so you can kind of see the epoxy. What I went with was 5-minute epoxy. It doesn't really set up in 5 minutes. It does become tacky. It seems to be an epoxy that will work with this type of plastic, and that's important because not all epoxy will work with all types of plastic, and it's very difficult to determine what type plastic this is because there's no stamp on it giving the code number for the type of epoxy. So from the reading I did, it seemed like the epoxy would work. I did a little test and it seems to be holding pretty good. I'll get to the foam fill in a later video, or later in the video rather. So you can see where the epoxy has puddled inside the wheel, inside the rim, and that's fine. I don't really care what it looks like as long as it's spanning the 2 halves. The 2 halves are tight together and it sets up in bonds. Doesn't matter how pretty it is because all that's going to be filled with foam later on anyway. This is kind of interesting. This is just epoxy that dripped down when I really filled almost half of the wheel with epoxy. I was really trying to glue too large of a section at one time, so when I flipped the wheel over, the epoxy had not set up. At that time I was actually using a very slow dry epoxy, and overnight it just kind of dripped down till it formed this stalactite. Kind of interesting. I'm just leaving it. That's not hurting anything. It's not in the way. Once the 2 halves of the wheel are glued back together, the next challenge has become how to rebuild the hub. The hub is the part of the wheel that the axle actually goes through, and on this particular wheel, the hub on the outside was still in pretty good shape, but the hub on the inside was completely destroyed. What you see here is actually a piece of copper tubing. Part of the process I used to rebuild the hub. I'm going to get you a close-up picture of the inside. You can see an orange tube. Inside that orange tube is actually a piece of copper. So a lot of this was determined because inside the hub to the left side there was actually a little projected area that I needed a plastic tubing to fit over, but I needed the inside diameter of that tubing to be such that it fit pretty tight, and then the inside diameter of that tube to be the size of the axle. So I went to the hardware store and actually came up with 2 pieces of tubing that work perfectly. This is 3/8 inch copper tubing. The inside of it is 1/4 inch, or a little bit above 1/4 inch, which works perfect for the axle. And then this is just some plastic tubing that just happens to fit over this perfectly. Not only does it fit over this copper tubing perfectly, it actually fits over the hub on the inside perfectly. So it was really just a stroke of luck to find something that works so well. So yesterday I fabricated those two parts, cut the exact lengths, got it in place, and epoxied that in overnight. So that's in place. The hub is formed. It's ready to go. So as you can see here, the 1/4 inch steel axle is in place. The hub has been rebuilt. Primarily the axle will be riding around a bushing of 3/8 inch copper, which copper's kind of soft, but I think for this purpose it'll be fine. And the wheel turns fine. Now it's a little wobbly right now. I've got to do a little bit of reshaping on this part before I fill it, and hopefully it will turn a little bit better. I'm using a heat gun on low heat setting to heat the plastic. Don't want to get it too hot, but I do want to get it hot enough that I can kind of take this area that's expanded and kind of reshape the wheel so it won't be quite so wobbly. All right, once the wheel is hot, it's pretty flexible. It's a matter of just kind of depressing this part here that has expanded, and then holding on to it until it cools off. And once it cools off, it'll retain its shape. Kind of a little guesswork at this part. I've decided to put one more layer of epoxy on the inside of the wheel where the joint is glued back together, just to build it up as much as possible before I put the foam filler inside the wheel. And while I do this, I thought I would explain a little bit about how to mix epoxy. So with epoxy, use equal parts of hardener with rosin. Real simple, and I'll show you how to mix that. But I'm going to do another thing here. I'm going to add black ink in with the epoxy, not because I need it inside the wheel, but because I want to see what the epoxy will look like. Because for the final coat of epoxy and rebuilding the rim of the wheel, I'd like for it to be black rather than clear. So I thought I'd do a little bit of experimenting with this stage of the epoxy and add the dye in just to see how much dye I need. This is a plastic lid from a coffee can and a little wood dowel that I have sharpened the end of it to use as a stirring stick. Also works as the applicator. So this is the hardener. I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 seconds of hardener. Now this is the rosin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we thoroughly mix. And the whole idea with epoxy is it has to be mixed well, very well. When working with epoxy, you've got to be very careful not to get any on the skin. In this particular case, that's very slim chance, but just in case, I've got some alcohol which will cut the epoxy. I've got it just about mixed, and I'm going to add the ink in to change the color. I'm using a Q-tip just to get some ink out. Really have no idea how much it's going to take, so I'm going to start with a few drops. And that looks like that's going to work very well. I'm tickled. Now I have black epoxy. I'm using the stirring stick as the applicator to get the epoxy deep into the wheel. I know it's kind of hard to see here without the lighting just right, but essentially I'm just getting another coat of epoxy down inside the rim before I use the foam filler. The final and perhaps the most difficult part of this repair is going to be filling in the missing part of the wheel. I'm going to essentially do it with epoxy, but I feel like I need some type of form in order to hold the epoxy in shape. So I came up with this idea of molding a piece of plastic of some type. to the shape of the wheel. So I've tried several different pieces of plastic. What I finally came up with was a Canada Dry 2-liter plastic bottle. I heated it, and it actually, when formed around the wheel, actually shrinks and shapes itself to the wheel exactly as you can see from this one. Now I haven't cut it off yet. I will in a few minutes. This is actually formed with one of the good wheels. So I'll pick out a part of this and tape it onto the wheel, and then we will try to fill this with epoxy somehow or another, and also come up with a way for the epoxy not to stick to the 2-liter bottle, because I want to be able to remove it afterwards. Now that the wheel is glued back together, everything is repaired except this gaping hole, and that's going to be the last thing that I work on. Right now I'm actually using it as an access hole into the wheel itself. So what I've decided to do, even though the wheel is glued back together, should be pretty solid, is I'm going to fill the inside of this wheel with foam fill. This material is fairly rigid. Actually, it's very rigid. I don't know that that you could make a wheel out of it and it would hold up, but I think it'll work fine for the inside of this wheel. My first thought was actually fill the inside of the wheel with epoxy and just basically make it a solid wheel. Unfortunately, that would become a very expensive process just with the cost of epoxy. This little box is about $15 here. It would take at least one, maybe two of those, who knows. So the foam fill cost about $3. I decided to go with it. What I want to do is fill almost up to the edge of the wheel where this hole is, because that will be epoxy. The final stage will be actually filling that area with epoxy. So now what I'm going to do is fill the inside with the foam fill. Well, the inside of the wheel has been filled with foam all the way up to this broken out part. I'm actually going to scrape a little bit of it out because I want to leave a void there that I can fill later on with epoxy. So I'll let this set up and then work on the final part probably tomorrow. The foam has set up hard enough, or sufficiently enough anyway, that I can now trim it. So even though I tried to leave it a little bit low, it expands as it dries, so it's expanded outside of the surface area of the wheel. I need it depressed, or not depressed, but cut down, yeah, maybe 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch below the rim to give an area for the epoxy to form the hard outer layer. So that's what's next on the list. The foam is pretty easy to work with. I think I can trim it down probably with a little utility blade. I said the whole idea is to get it an area built to where I can pour epoxy in that will form the hard outer layer of the wheel. So we'll work on this for a few minutes. I'm not going to video all of it, and I'll come back and show you the wheel once I've got this trimmed down.